Welcome to our History Channel, where we embark on thrilling journeys through time, revisiting some of the most astonishing and consequential moments that have forever altered the course of human history. Here, we don't just tell stories, we relive them, bringing to life the characters, emotions, and intense decisions that have shaped the world as we know it. Every episode is a doorway into the past, a vivid experience that thrusts you into the heart of pivotal events, giving you a front-row seat to the dramas that unfolded across battlefields, in royal courts, and through the hearts and minds of extraordinary people. Before we dive into today's gripping tale, let's first immerse ourselves in the backdrop of this historical drama, a moment when time itself was the most critical factor, a moment where every second counted, and each decision could tip the scales between triumph and tragedy. Our story takes us to a place where fate hung in the balance, where men were forced to push themselves beyond their limits, where courage, duty, and the will to survive collided in a chaotic whirl of uncertainty. Today, we revisit the fateful hours of Major Marcus Reno, Captain Frederick Benteen, and General George Armstrong Custer, three men locked in a deadly game of strategy during the Battle of the Little Bighorn, a story of ambition, miscommunication, and ultimate sacrifice. It was the summer of 1876, the warm winds carrying whispers of tension, anger, and bloodlust as the Great Sioux War raged across the western frontier of America. The country, in the throes of expansion, had its sights set on the vast and wild territories held by the Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyenne. These lands were sacred, protected by the native tribes, who saw the encroaching settlers as invaders. Conflict was inevitable, and in this turbulent period, General George Custer emerged as a figure both revered and despised, an enigmatic man driven by ambition, ego, and a fierce desire for glory. As the sun climbed higher in the sky on June 25, 1876, Benteen's ride began under circumstances thick with tension. Time, precious, fleeting time, was slipping away with every stride his men took through the rugged landscape. It was as though an invisible clock ticked ever louder with each passing moment. Benteen, loyal but ever the pragmatist, knew the weight of his orders. Move swiftly but with caution. The terrain was unforgiving, the heat stifling, and the threat of unseen enemies always present. But Custer's voice, his orders, so clear in their urgency, echoed in Benteen's mind. At the heart of this unfolding drama was Henry Voss, the chief trumpeter, whose role in this story may seem small but was, in truth, monumental. As the relentless sun beat down on the dry earth, Voss was tasked with the critical mission of delivering Custer's orders. His was not just a ride through the wilderness, it was a race against time itself. With his heart pounding, Voss spurred his horse forward, the landscape blurring past him as he pushed through exhaustion in the oppressive heat. By the time the dust settled behind him, Voss had made the 0.6-mile trip in a remarkable 5 minutes, traveling at an astonishing speed of 7 to 8 miles per hour. Upon delivering Custer's message, Voss collapsed, gasping for breath, his mind swirling with the urgency of the situation. He had done his part, but the weight of responsibility now shifted to Benteen. Custer's instructions were straightforward yet filled with ominous implications. If nothing is found before reaching the first line of bluffs, proceed to the second with the same instructions. The bluffs rose ahead of Benteen and his men like silent sentinels, watching over a land steeped in conflict and uncertainty. As they advanced another mile, the tension in the air grew palpable, the silence between the men punctuated only by the rhythmic pounding of hooves against the earth. By 12:18 p.m., just as the heat of the day reached its peak, Voss delivered yet another message from Custer, carried by Regimental Sergeant Major William Sherrow. The orders were clear and unyielding. If nothing was spotted from the second line of bluffs, Benteen was to press into the valley, and if nothing was found there, continue into the next valley. The words hung heavy in the air, carrying with them an unspoken dread. The men knew that danger lurked beyond every ridge, that each valley could be the setting for a deadly ambush. As Benteen's men moved forward, the vast landscape stretched before them, eerily quiet, almost as if holding its breath for the storm that was about to come. The sun cast long shadows over the rocky terrain, and the air was thick with the scent of dust and tension. Every step, every turn of the head, was filled with anticipation. Where were the enemy forces? Where were Custer and his battalion? The uncertainty gnawed at Benteen, but he knew he had to press on. There was no turning back now. They were deep in hostile territory, and the only way out was forward. The clock was ticking, and Custer's position remained a mystery. Benteen could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. Had Custer already engaged with the enemy? Were they being drawn into a trap? Or was Custer forging ahead, believing his reinforcements were close behind? The question swirled in Benteen's mind as he led his men through the valley, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. And then, as the men reached the crest of the bluff, the landscape below revealed a sight that sent shivers down their spines. Smoke, distant and faint but unmistakable, it rose from the valley floor like a dark omen, curling upward into the sky, signaling that somewhere below, the battle had begun. Benteen's heart raced. Was it too late? Had Custer already engaged the Sioux forces? The realization hit hard. Time, that elusive enemy, may have finally run out. The story of Benteen, Custer, and the Battle of Little Bighorn is one of history's most tragic and haunting episodes. It is a tale of valor and misjudgment, of men caught in the unforgiving grip of fate. As Benteen pressed onward, he could feel the weight of history bearing down on him. Every decision, every action taken in those critical moments would shape the outcome of the battle and determine the fate of hundreds of men. In the distance, gunfire erupted like thunder, echoing through the valley, signaling the climax of this dramatic encounter. It was in these moments that the true essence of leadership was tested. Would Benteen and his men arrive in time to tip the scales of battle in Custer's favor, or would they be too late to save their comrades from the onslaught that awaited them? This story is not just about battle plans and military maneuvers. It's about the human experience, about men driven by duty, honor, and the relentless pull of destiny. It's about decisions made in the heat of the moment, with lives hanging in the balance. It's about courage and fear, glory and loss, and the ever-present hand of fate guiding them all toward a final, inevitable confrontation. So, as we stand on the precipice of this historical moment, let us take a moment to reflect on the extraordinary courage and resilience of these men. Let us honor their sacrifice and remember that, even in the face of overwhelming odds, they fought with a determination that echoes through history. This is the story of Benteen, Custer, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn, a story that continues to captivate and inspire, a story that will never be forgotten. In a letter dated February 24, 1892, Major Frederick Benteen wrote to his friend Theodore Golden, recalling a critical moment during the Battle of the Little Bighorn, an event that has been dissected and debated by historians and military enthusiasts alike for over a century. The controversy revolves around Benteen's actions during those chaotic hours and the cryptic orders he received from General George Custer. This single moment of miscommunication and the subsequent decisions made have sparked endless speculation about what could have been, what should have been, and who was to blame for the tragic outcome that followed. Benteen's recollection is hazy, a reflection of the confusion that defined the battle. He remembered receiving a message from Regimental Sergeant Major William Sherrow, often spelled as Shiro, but the orders were vague, lacking the precision needed in a life-and-death situation. According to Benteen, Sherrow's message instructed him to continue moving until he found the valley, any valley, and to engage the enemy if encountered. There was no clear direction, no specific target, just a vague command to keep pushing forward. The journey Sherrow undertook to reach Benteen was fraught with danger, the terrain unforgiving and the heat oppressive. Unlike Chief Trumpeter Henry Voss, whose earlier ride to deliver Custer's orders had been relatively smooth, Sherrow faced greater challenges as he raced across the bluffs. By the time Sherrow finally reached Benteen, exhaustion had set in, his horse having pushed itself to its limits. Sherrow had traveled 1.2 miles, arriving at Benteen's position around 12:26 p.m., galloping at a remarkable pace of 10 miles per hour. But by then, it may have already been too late. Time had slipped away, and with it, perhaps the only chance of changing the course of the battle. In retrospect, Custer's orders appear frustratingly unclear, a jumble of half-explained directives that left Benteen to interpret them on his own. Historians have long debated whether Custer's cryptic instructions contributed to the devastating outcome at Little Bighorn. Some argue that had Custer provided more precise orders, Benteen might have been able to act with greater urgency and clarity. Others believe that Benteen, for all his experience and competence, should have taken the initiative regardless of the vagueness of Custer's commands. The Reno Court of Inquiry, held in 1879, aimed to uncover the truth behind the infamous defeat, and it was here that Benteen's actions came under intense scrutiny. Critics of Benteen have accused him of dereliction of duty, arguing that he deliberately slowed his approach, thereby abandoning Custer and the men who fought and died at the hands of the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. During the inquiry, Benteen was asked directly about his decision-making process that day, a question that would define his legacy. Q. You acted on your own judgment when returning to the point where you met Major Reno. Entirely, Benteen responded, his voice resolute but carrying the weight of years of reflection and doubt. Benteen's answer, while straightforward, did little to quell the controversy. His decision to return to Major Marcus Reno's position instead of rushing to Custer's aid has been criticized by some as a grave miscalculation, perhaps even a betrayal. Yet, Benteen has always maintained that his actions were justified, that he was acting based on the information he had at the time. He argued that he could not have known Custer's dire situation, and by the time he reached Reno, the battle was already well underway. To Benteen, the idea of charging blindly into an uncertain and potentially suicidal situation made no sense. He chose to regroup with Reno, believing that a coordinated effort would be more effective than scattering their forces across the battlefield. This decision has haunted Benteen's memory, casting a shadow over his otherwise distinguished military career. Critics have accused him of cowardice, claiming that he should have pushed forward regardless of the risks, that he should have sensed Custer's need for immediate support. But Benteen's supporters argue that he was unfairly scapegoated for a disaster that was not of his making. They point to the vagueness of Custer's orders, the confusion of the battlefield, and the unpredictable nature of warfare. One of the key points of contention is the timing of Benteen's arrival at Reno's position. Some have suggested that Benteen intentionally delayed his approach, perhaps out of a personal disdain for Custer. The two men had a history of tension, their personalities clashing during their service together. While there is no direct evidence to suggest that Benteen harbored any malicious intent, the idea has persisted in popular retellings of the battle. The inquiry into the Battle of the Little Bighorn did little to resolve the debate. Benteen, for his part, remained steadfast in his belief that he did the right thing, that his actions were guided by sound military judgment. He pointed out that had he rushed headlong into the fight without proper reconnaissance, he and his men could have been cut down before they even reached Custer's position. In the chaos of battle, where communication was scarce and confusion reigned supreme, Benteen made the best decisions he could with the limited information available to him. Despite his defense, the lingering doubts about Benteen's actions have left a complicated legacy. His involvement in the Battle of the Little Bighorn continues to be a subject of debate among historians. Was he a pragmatic commander, doing his best under impossible circumstances? Or did he hesitate at a critical moment, contributing to one of the most infamous defeats in U.S. military history? As time passes, new interpretations of the battle emerge, offering fresh perspectives on Benteen's role. Some historians now argue that the failure lay not with Benteen but with Custer himself. They point to Custer's overconfidence, his failure to properly scout the enemy's position, and his decision to divide his forces, leaving each detachment vulnerable to attack. In this view, Benteen's actions, while controversial, may have been the most logical choice in a chaotic and desperate situation. Others, however, continue to question whether more decisive action on Benteen's part could have changed the outcome. Had he rushed to Custer's aid, perhaps the battle might have ended differently. Perhaps Custer's battalion would not have been annihilated, and the history of the American West would have taken a different course. But such speculation, while intriguing, remains in the realm of what-ifs and possibilities. What is certain is that Benteen's story is inseparable from the larger narrative of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, a narrative that has captivated and confounded people for generations. The mystery of what happened that fateful day, the decisions made in the heat of battle, and the enduring legacy of those involved continue to inspire debate and discussion. In the end, the story of Benteen and Little Bighorn is not just a story of one man's decisions but of the complexities of leadership, the fog of war, and the heavy burden of history. The questions it raises about duty, loyalty, and judgment are as relevant today as they were in 1876, and they serve as a powerful reminder of the thin line between success and failure in the crucible of combat. The tale of Benteen's actions at the Battle of Little Bighorn is a story fraught with controversy, conflicting narratives, and the kind of ambiguity that invites endless debate. The statement, "I thought there would be fighting on the trail and it was better to help there," marks the beginning of Benteen's justification for his decision to return to the trail instead of continuing his reconnaissance mission as some of Custer's orders may have implied. It reveals a man caught between competing instincts, one of urgency and pragmatism, and the other of duty to follow unclear orders to their ambiguous conclusion. When Benteen later testified about his actions, he explained that he felt he had gone far enough, and believed his presence was more urgently needed back on the trail rather than continuing on his scouting mission. Benteen's rationale was, in his mind, logical. He had gone deep into unfamiliar and potentially hostile territory, without encountering any sign of the enemy in the valleys that Custer had directed him to investigate. His soldiers and horses were exhausted, and the risk of overextending his forces without any sight of the enemy seemed too great. He felt the best course of action was to return to the trail, rejoining with the pack train, where he anticipated he would be more useful. However, this decision has become one of the most scrutinized elements of Benteen's legacy. His actions, or inactions, as some have characterized them, have been blamed for failing to provide crucial reinforcements to Custer, leading to the infamous massacre of Custer's men. Critics argue that Benteen's reconnaissance was insufficient and that by cutting his mission short, he had disobeyed Custer's orders. Custer had reportedly wanted Benteen to scout all the way into the Little Bighorn Valley, a directive that, according to some interpretations, was never fully carried out. During the Reno inquiry, Benteen was asked if there had been any limitations on how far he was supposed to go in his reconnaissance. His answer was unequivocal: no limitations except for the valleys. This statement, by Benteen's own admission, suggests that Custer expected him to press forward, further than Benteen ultimately did. This has led to a variety of interpretations. To his critics, Benteen's decision to return to the trail instead of pushing further into the valley is viewed as a deliberate disobedience of orders. To his supporters, Benteen's actions were those of a seasoned soldier who knew when to trust his instincts. Yet, it's in these contradictions that the heart of the controversy lies. Was Benteen's testimony at the inquiry false, crafted to cover his tracks and shift the blame away from himself? Or were his post-battle statements, in which he claimed to have scouted for miles without finding a valley, truthful? It's here that the ambiguity thickens, leaving room for doubt and suspicion. Shortly after the battle, Benteen wrote to his wife, providing what seems to be a more personal and candid account of his actions. In this letter, he explained that he had scouted up and down the hills for nearly 10 miles, searching for a valley as Custer had instructed. But despite his efforts, he found nothing. His horses were rapidly wearing out, their energy drained from the grueling conditions. Satisfied that he had done everything in his power to fulfill Custer's orders, Benteen made the decision to rejoin the trail, arriving just ahead of the pack train. The letter to his wife reveals a man who, at least in his own mind, believed that he had done his duty. He had scouted as far as he reasonably could, given the conditions, and having found no enemy, he returned to a position where he thought he would be of the most help. His actions, as described in the letter, portray a soldier attempting to balance conflicting priorities in the heat of battle. He was torn between following vague orders to an uncertain end or returning to a position where his efforts could be more tangible. Yet, these justifications did little to silence his detractors. Critics continued to argue that by cutting his reconnaissance short, Benteen had failed to provide Custer with the support he desperately needed. Some even suggested that Benteen's personal disdain for Custer influenced his decision to abandon the scouting mission prematurely, though Benteen himself denied this accusation. His post-battle letters and testimony present a picture of a man who believed he had acted with integrity and according to the best judgment he could muster under difficult circumstances. But history has been less forgiving. The conflicting narratives that arose from Benteen's actions have become a focal point of the larger debate surrounding the Battle of Little Bighorn. On one hand, there are those who believe that Benteen acted in a manner consistent with sound military judgment, adapting to the situation as it evolved and making decisions based on the immediate needs of his men and the realities of the battlefield. On the other hand, there are those who view Benteen as complicit in Custer's downfall, his failure to carry out the reconnaissance to its full extent a critical factor in the eventual disaster. The enduring debate raises important questions about the nature of command, obedience, and accountability in the heat of battle. To what extent are commanders expected to follow orders when those orders are vague or potentially dangerous? How much latitude should be given to individual judgment in the face of unclear instructions? And, ultimately, where does the responsibility for failure lie, on the shoulders of the one who gave the orders or the one who carried them out? As historians continue to pore over the details of the Battle of Little Bighorn, the role of Benteen remains a deeply divisive issue. Was he a cautious and pragmatic leader who made the best decisions he could under the circumstances? Or was he a man who, by cutting short his mission, contributed to one of the most infamous military defeats in American history? These questions linger, much like the fog that shrouded the battlefield on that fateful day. Benteen's story is not one of simple heroism or villainy but of a man grappling with the complexities of war, where every decision carries the weight of history. And like so many figures who find themselves at the center of such pivotal events, Benteen's legacy is one that will likely continue to be debated for generations to come. This letter supports the idea that Benteen acted responsibly during the Battle of Little Bighorn, even though his accounts of Custer's orders exhibit some inconsistencies. Benteen claimed that Custer both suggested he return if the valley appeared clear and trusted him to make judgment calls based on the situation on the ground. This duality reflects Custer's reliance on Benteen's experience as a senior officer and suggests that Custer entrusted Benteen with the authority to adapt as necessary. The controversy surrounding Benteen's actions seems more driven by those seeking to criticize him, rather than by any demonstrable failure on his part. His detractors argue that he should have done more or pushed further into the valley, but their claims often appear speculative and overlook the nuanced realities of battle. It seems unlikely that Custer, a seasoned commander who had experience in the complexities of warfare, would send Benteen on a futile expedition into a barren valley. The idea that Custer would want Benteen back with the main force once it was clear the valley held no immediate threat is supported by basic military logic. Benteen's primary responsibility was to ensure that no hostile forces were hiding on the command's flank, and by his own account, he fulfilled that duty. He scouted the area, found no immediate threat, and returned to where he believed his presence would be of most use. If the Little Bighorn Valley appeared empty, even from a distance of 6 or 8 miles, it would make sense for Custer to expect Benteen to return promptly. The terrain was challenging, and the risk of separating the forces further without a clear objective would have been unnecessary and potentially disastrous. The criticism of Benteen, therefore, seems less about his actions and more about the tragic outcome of the battle itself. When disasters of such scale occur, there is often a need to assign blame, and Benteen, as one of the officers involved, became an easy target for those seeking answers. But the reality is likely more complex. Benteen acted within the scope of his orders, used his best judgment, and returned to the trail when he believed his reconnaissance mission was complete. The debate over whether Benteen shirked his duties seems to lack the weight of significant evidence. His actions, based on his perspective and the orders he received, will align with the responsibilities he was given, to ensure the safety of the flank and to rejoin the main force once the situation was clear. Whether or not Benteen could have made different decisions, the notion that he deliberately disobeyed orders or acted irresponsibly appears less credible when considering the full context of his position. In his letters to his wife, Benteen provided a detailed account of the regiment's division during the campaign, emphasizing that they had been split into 3 battalions, approximately 15 miles from the Indian village. Although Custer wasn't entirely sure of the village's exact location, he ordered Benteen to sweep the left flank and search for any signs of the enemy or a valley that might indicate the village's proximity. This task put Benteen in a challenging position, both strategically and physically, as he navigated a rugged landscape full of defiles and bluffs that hindered progress. At the 1879 inquiry, Benteen described the harsh conditions he encountered. The terrain was difficult and unforgiving, and despite pushing forward to the second line of bluffs, he found no valley that might lead to the Indian encampment. His reasoning was sound. The native forces, he believed, would likely have avoided such treacherous terrain, opting for easier routes to maneuver their forces and protect their village. Based on this understanding, Benteen believed that his mission was to ensure the left flank was clear of any threats as the regiment advanced down Reno Creek. Whether this responsibility was explicitly laid out in his orders or was an implication he inferred from his experience, Benteen approached the task with the professionalism expected of a seasoned officer. The debate over Benteen's actions, both during and after the Battle of the Little Bighorn, often hinges on semantics. Scholars and critics may argue about what to call his maneuver, whether it was a reconnaissance mission, a flanking operation, or something else entirely. But such labels, while academically interesting, are ultimately irrelevant to the practical realities of what transpired. Benteen and Custer were experienced military men. Despite their differences, they were professionals who understood the complexities of battle and the importance of flexibility in command decisions. Benteen knew what was required of him. His mission was to scout the flank, search for signs of the enemy, and return to the main body of the regiment when his task was complete. He executed this mission with the knowledge and judgment that had been honed through years of service, navigating the difficult terrain and making decisions based on the conditions he faced in real time. His decision to return to the command, after concluding that no significant threat was present on the left flank, demonstrates a calculated response to a fluid situation. The criticisms of Benteen's actions often seem to overlook the realities of the battlefield and the limitations of communication during the heat of battle. While military historians may continue to analyze and debate his movements, Benteen's actions reflect the experience and pragmatism of a seasoned soldier who was tasked with an uncertain mission in the face of challenging circumstances. He did what he believed was necessary to ensure the safety of the regiment, returning when he had sufficiently cleared the left flank. This speaks to his professionalism and his understanding of his role in the larger strategy, even if history has not always been kind in its judgments. Custer's trust in Benteen was evident, as he relied on his seasoned officer to exercise judgment in an unpredictable and complex battlefield environment. The core of this narrative isn't about whether Benteen adhered strictly to tactical definitions or rigid orders. Rather, it underscores the reality of experienced officers making rapid, often critical decisions amid chaos. Custer understood the importance of careful scouting, particularly in a situation where the terrain and enemy positions were unknown. To this end, he instructed Benteen to send a well-mounted officer with a small detachment ahead to survey the bluffs and ensure no threats lurked there. Benteen, ever diligent, selected 1st Lieutenant Francis Marion Gibson to lead this small scouting party. Gibson, along with 6 men, pressed forward to carry out the mission. However, even as Benteen organized this detachment, the landscape conspired against him. Mounted on a fast, reliable horse, Benteen found himself ahead of his own scouts and outriders, a testament to the challenging conditions that his battalion faced. The flatlands provided little resistance, but as soon as they approached the ridges, the harsh topography began to complicate their advance. The bluffs, with their steep and rugged slopes, presented obstacles that neither Benteen nor his men could have foreseen. The horses, already under strain from the heat and difficult ground, began to tire. Benteen had no choice but to adjust his route, moving his battalion rightward from their original course. This deviation wasn't a matter of choice or lapse in strategy, but a necessity dictated by the unforgiving terrain. The horses simply couldn't handle the steep ascents without risking exhaustion and injury, and Benteen had to prioritize the well-being of his men and their mounts. Benteen's actions during this phase of the battle reflect the flexibility and practical decision-making that Custer had placed his faith in. The challenging terrain forced Benteen to adapt on the fly, showing his ability to navigate the difficult circumstances that arose. This wasn't a battle fought purely by orders and plans but by quick thinking, adaptation, and resourcefulness. Benteen's deviation from the original path wasn't a failure, it was a demonstration of his ability to handle unforeseen challenges while keeping his battalion intact. Ultimately, Benteen's decision to shift his route as the ridges became impassable for his horses was rooted in the understanding that maintaining his battalion's strength was crucial. He knew that exhausting his men and mounts in the rugged terrain would compromise their ability to contribute to the overall campaign. Instead, he chose to alter course, preserving their energy and ensuring they remained combat-ready for the next phase of the mission. Custer's confidence in Benteen was justified. In a chaotic and uncertain situation, Benteen made the hard choices necessary to protect his men while still fulfilling the spirit of his orders. At the 1879 inquiry, Captain Edward Godfrey testified to the toll that the treacherous landscape took on both the men and their horses during the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The horses, he recounted, grew increasingly weary from the relentless climbing and descending. The steep inclines and rough terrain caused many to fall behind, unable to keep up with the demanding pace. These conditions forced Benteen and his men into a battle with the landscape itself, as much as with any enemy forces. In 1946, Private Charles Windolph, one of the few survivors of the battle, reflected on the arduous journey through this unforgiving terrain. His description paints a vivid picture of the rugged, rolling hills that dominated their march. He recalled how the battalion veered mercilessly to the right, inching closer to the path that Custer and Reno had taken ahead of them. Windolph estimated they had traveled about 7 or 8 miles, a distance that might seem manageable under normal circumstances but was grueling due to the difficult terrain. The constant climbs, the abrupt stops, and the frequent starts created a grueling experience for both men and horses, making the journey far more punishing than it might have been on flat ground. When Benteen's battalion finally reached a small valley, it was a welcome relief. The continuous strain of moving up and down hills, combined with the unpredictability of the terrain, had exhausted the men and their horses alike. A more consistent, accelerated pace might have been easier, but the constant shifts in elevation wore down the battalion. The combination of the terrain and the necessity of constant vigilance in hostile territory made even a short distance feel like an ordeal. The soldiers, who were used to long marches, found this one to be particularly taxing, both physically and mentally. The exact distance that Benteen's battalion covered during their mission remains uncertain, largely due to the deviations they had to make because of the terrain. The constantly shifting angles of their march and the necessity to navigate around bluffs, hills, and other obstacles made it difficult to determine precisely how far they had gone. Nonetheless, we know that the route Benteen took was a challenging one, and his ultimate decision to return to the main trail reflected both the exhaustion of his men and the limited progress they had made. By the time Benteen returned to the main trail, he had already covered a substantial distance, his battalion worn down by the landscape's relentless challenges. The march had taken longer and proven more difficult than anticipated, but Benteen had fulfilled his duty to scout the left flank and ensure there were no immediate threats. Although the march was grueling, Benteen's ability to navigate such difficult conditions and bring his battalion back in a state fit for combat demonstrated his leadership and understanding of the demands of the battlefield. The route he took, while not linear, was a necessary adaptation to the unforgiving terrain that dominated the region and shaped the course of their movements. This aligns well with the assessment provided by Lieutenant Winfield Edgerly, who, like Benteen, reflected on the complex nature of their trek during the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Edgerly later reaffirmed his estimate of a 3-mile stretch before they turned toward what has been identified as No Name Creek. According to his account, Benteen shifted direction about 6 miles into the valley before heading into the hills. This movement was later clarified during questioning, particularly as the battalion moved into Reno Creek Valley and then back onto the main trail. Edgerly's observations provide a critical piece of the puzzle in understanding the movements of Benteen's battalion during this challenging march. Roger Darling's book, Benteen's Scout *, offers perhaps the most thorough analysis of this particular segment of the campaign. Darling constructed a detailed map using the original quadrangles, charting Benteen's route as accurately as possible given the available historical evidence. However, as further analysis has shown, based on the testimonies of Godfrey and Edgerly, it seems that Benteen likely entered No Name Creek Valley slightly lower than what Darling's map suggests. This adjustment better aligns with the terrain and would have been a more feasible route for a horseman traversing such challenging conditions. The terrain forced Benteen to adapt his movements, which resulted in subtle deviations from what might have been expected in less demanding circumstances. Regardless of these minor cartographical details, the general consensus is that Benteen likely covered approximately 4 miles before reaching No Name Creek. While the exact route may vary slightly depending on the source or interpretation, the overall distance covered remains consistent with the broader accounts of the journey. The rugged landscape and the necessity to scout cautiously meant that even short distances took a heavy toll on the battalion, both in terms of time and physical exertion. These movements, though small in distance, were significant in their impact on the battalion's condition and their ability to respond to unfolding events on the battlefield. It seems likely that Benteen began his journey at a trot, likely around 6 miles per hour, as would be expected for a scouting mission. However, the increasingly difficult terrain inevitably slowed his pace. By the time he reached No Name Creek, estimated to be around 1:25 p.m., his speed had dropped to approximately 3 miles per hour. These estimates of distance and speed, largely derived from topographical maps, don't fully account for the rugged terrain that Benteen and his men traversed, suggesting that the actual distance covered may have been greater than the maps indicate. Godfrey, who was stationed at the rear of the column, observed that despite the challenges, the battalion moved quickly. On occasion, he even ordered a trot, demonstrating the battalion's efforts to maintain momentum as much as possible. The rough terrain, combined with the need to stop and start frequently, meant that estimating the exact distance and time taken was inherently difficult. Nevertheless, Benteen later claimed that the journey to Reno Creek took roughly 1.5 hours, a figure that seems consistent with the conditions they faced. His timekeeping has generally held up well under scrutiny, with little dispute over this aspect of his account. However, some variation in timing estimates exists. Private Windolf, for example, suggested that the journey may have taken closer to 2 hours, a small but notable difference from Benteen's recollection. While Windolf's estimate provides an interesting counterpoint, there are no other records that corroborate this extended timeframe. Given the chaotic and exhausting nature of the ride, it is understandable that different participants might recall the timing with slight variations. The strain of navigating the bluffs, valleys, and hills likely made the march feel longer to those involved. Ultimately, while the precise distance and timing may remain subjects of debate, Benteen's estimates, particularly regarding time, appear to be reasonably accurate. His attention to timekeeping during the march was one of the few constants in an otherwise unpredictable and difficult environment. The terrain may have distorted perceptions of distance, but Benteen's estimate of roughly 1.5 hours for the journey to Reno Creek has withstood the test of time, providing a reliable anchor for reconstructing this phase of the battle. Benteen likely began his journey at a steady trot of about 6 miles per hour, but as the terrain grew more rugged, his speed inevitably slowed. By the time he reached No Name Creek, around 1:25 p.m., his pace had dropped to approximately 3 miles per hour. The distance estimates that have been derived from topographical maps provide a rough guide, but they don't fully capture the difficult and uneven terrain that Benteen and his men had to navigate. This means that the actual distance they covered may have been greater than the maps suggest. Godfrey, who was positioned at the rear of the column, observed the battalion's movement closely. Despite the challenges posed by the terrain, Godfrey noted that they moved rapidly, at times even ordering the column to trot in order to maintain their pace. This suggests that while the march was taxing, the battalion was still pushing forward with as much speed as they could muster under the circumstances. Estimating the exact timing of the journey is tricky, but Benteen later claimed that it took about 1.5 hours to reach Reno Creek. While his distance estimates might not have been entirely accurate, his timekeeping has largely held up under scrutiny. There has been little dispute over the accuracy of his timing, which suggests that Benteen kept a careful eye on the passage of time during the march. Private Windolf, however, offered a slightly different account. He estimated that the journey took closer to 2 hours, a slight deviation from Benteen's recollection. Unfortunately, no other records exist to either confirm or refute Windolf's estimate, so it remains a solitary counterpoint to Benteen's more widely accepted timing. Given the physical and mental strain of the march through such difficult terrain, it's not surprising that different participants might recall the timing differently. In the end, while the exact distances and times may be open to some debate, Benteen's timekeeping has generally been accepted as accurate. His estimation of about 1.5 hours for the journey to Reno Creek fits with the broader understanding of the conditions they faced. Although terrain and exhaustion may have affected perceptions of distance, Benteen's careful attention to time provides a solid anchor for understanding this crucial phase of the battle.